Welcome to episode 51 of the Noclip podcast. Danny here with Jesse. Hi, Jesse.
Oh, what's going on? It's a beautiful snowy day up here in Canada and the whole country.
Man, it's mildly cloudy. Actually, it's really cloudy here in Oakland, which is about as wintry as it gets. Does that mean now you basically have snow for 4 months?
Well, you know what? Because of this weird thing called climate change, it turns out it's not as snowy in Canada as you'd think. It's a lot more rainy, unfortunately.
Oh, that sounds great.
Yeah, woo!
Yeah, that's awesome. That means you don't have to dig your car out of the snow anymore. You don't have like old ladies slipping on the
But
path.
that's the joy of this country. And you know, with the great healthcare system that we have, it's okay if old ladies fall on the ice. It's all right.
Exactly. That's part of the new Trudeau mission, right?
Yeah.
It's free hips for everyone. It's a classic Canadian humor. We'll all just go to, what's the name of it? Sugar, I've forgotten. What's the name of the coffee shop that everyone goes to there?
Oh, Tim Hortons. You got to get those Tim Biebs, baby. Justin Bieber crossover with Tim Hortons. I don't know what we're doing up. Yeah, I don't know what we're doing up here anymore.
The only thing I know is I went to a Tim Hortons and then a few days later somebody sent me a video of a lady taking a poo in a Tim Hortons.
Yes, that happens more often than you'd think.
Yeah, well, you know, I guess it's cold out there, so you gotta poop somewhere.
You gotta poop somewhere.
Today on the episode, I'm very excited for this one because this is sort of works with the format. Today we are talking to Colin Anderson. This is an interview taken from our upcoming documentary on the history of DMA designs, which if you don't remember or don't know, this was a crew in Dundee, Scotland, responsible for making a bunch of games, including Lemmings, which was one of the hottest tickets in video games in the 1990s, and a little series called Grand Theft Auto. They made the first 2 GTA games, and then they evolved, sort of converted into a studio in Edinburgh, which would quickly become Rockstar North. But DMA Design is kind of the progenitor era, which runs from like the late 80s right up until the launch of GTA 3, kind of. So like 2001, basically. 2001, around then. And Colin was the audio director at DMA during this time. So he was basically overseeing all of the projects that they were working on. And as you'll see in the documentary, that's quite a lot of projects. It's not just games like GTA 1 and GTA 2. It's games like Body Harvest, Kid Kirby, the cancelled Kirby game, Tank Ticks, Wild Metal Country, a bunch of like cancelled games like Covert. Well, I guess that evolved into Tactics. We get into a lot of this sort of stuff in the documentary. But today, this is basically a segment of the interview that I did with Colin, or this is a wider piece of the interview I did with Colin, because as is always the case when we do these great interviews, we can't stick it all in the doc. So some of this is actually in the doc and some of it isn't. But it's a great little journey through one of the most iconic aspects of the first 2 GTA games, Jesse, which was the radio stations. I'm interested in your perspective on this because I am going to assume, based on our specific ages, that perhaps you had never really played GTA 1 and 2. Is that right?
Yeah, you know, I think GTA 1 and 2 came out when I was 3 years old, roughly.
Okay.
So I definitely didn't play that one. Well, I did actually later. There was like a brief period where Rockstar was giving it away on their website. And I remember I downloaded it then. I gave it like 30 minutes of my time and I decided this is too old for me. I was like 14 when I played it. I was probably 14. But I had spent most of my childhood playing San Andreas and GTA 4 and a little bit of Vice City. And that was kind of the thing that I grew up on. And man, those games, classics. It's actually been a very Grand Theft Auto week for me. I've been working on this podcast, obviously. It's been a lot of fun listening to the older radio stations and the music and everything and hearing how much of that identity of the Grand Theft Auto series existed so far back. It wasn't something that just like sprung up with 3 and 4 or Grand Theft Auto, San Andreas and Vice City, but it was there from the start. And on top of working on this, I've also been working on something else on the latest Grand Theft Auto trilogy release, the definitive edition.
Right.
So it's been a very Grand Theft Auto week for me. I've been embedded in the classics. It's been a lot of fun going through them and hearing the music and the sounds and especially the radio stations, which is something that I've really been enjoying hearing, like I said, for GTA 1 and 2 working on this.
That's interesting how you said that, like, the identity of those games comes through in those, because having spent a bunch of time editing this doc and like going through all this, and Frank recorded all the gameplay first, but I've been sort of making my way through, is that the radio stations in 1 are almost like not the only part of those games that I feel exists in those in GTA 3 and onwards, but definitely the like pop culture satire aspect of GTA 1 and 2 is like, it's mostly the radio stations, right?
Exactly. And that's something that you feel in 4 and something that you feel in San Andreas and in Vice City and 3 especially, where, like that, I think when I look at Grand Theft Auto 5 even, that is such a big part of the game where most of it is, doing those things. But you're right. I like listening to this music and watching some of the gameplay of Grand Theft Auto 1 and 2, you don't get that sense that was like so permeating in any part of the game outside of, you're right, the radio stations and the DJs that come on very briefly, but who come on to give their bits, and the audio tracks that play when there's like an advertisement or something.
Yeah, and they didn't really do a lot of like they leaned into that definitely a lot more in GTA 2, because by then it had become a thing, and then you, as you said, you can, in 3, for this DMA doc, we've interviewed, it's like, I think on record, I think in terms of people we actually have talking, it's 8 people. And I just finished one. I have another one tomorrow, and I just finished one a couple of days ago with a guy who was there for all 3 of them. And he was talking about how largely GTA 3, because they had so much of a technical hurdle to make that game 3D, they basically just used GTA 1 as the template. Like in terms of gameplay, they didn't try and reinvent a lot of that sort of stuff. They had it all there in GTA 1 in that New York level, and they just had to, not just had to, but like they had to go through the incredibly difficult process of turning this gameplay into 3D, which was the death knell for so many UK studios. Like, I think this is one of the things we'll get into a little bit in the doc, but there were so many absolute powerhouse UK development studios which disappeared once the PlayStation came out. Once any 3D development was going on, it was basically like asking a bunch of like painters if they could sculpt. You were asking them to have a completely different skill set. So folks like the Bitmap brothers, Sensible Software, like loads of these who would have been considered like the cream of the crop when it came to UK development, just went the way of the dodo. And DMA somehow, well, not somehow, we talk about it in our doc, but they made the transition. They figured it out. And it was really difficult for them. And what's weird is that GTA 1 and GTA 2 are kind of still 2D games. They were especially 3 was using like there was 3D engines going on there. But in terms of the way they presented themselves, they were still 2D. They still looked 2D on screenshots, which was the only way people saw games before they bought them back then. So it became this really interesting sort of challenge for them. So it's cool to talk about the radio stations in these, because I do feel like, even we put up a teaser trailer on the channel for this documentary, and all I did was use B-roll and the music. And I think it shows how like evocative the music and sound effects from these games are, because people were like, I still remember the lyrics to that country music song. The men folk found their women scary because they were so big and hairy. It's like I haven't heard that song in like 15 years. It's absolutely wild. So, shall we get into it?
Sure.
All right, let's jump straight in. This is Colin Anderson, formerly of DMA Designs, talking about the music and sound design of Grand Theft Auto 1 and Grand Theft Auto 2. Take it away, Jesse.
Like Danny said, this week we're hearing an interview with Colin Anderson, DMA Designs audio manager in the mid to late 90s. He'd been working with the company on some of its earlier projects like Lemmings and the fantastic Uniracer, and while DMA's catalog of games up to that point were well received, the team's next title, Grand Theft Auto, would be something completely different. And as Colin tells it, while the game was novel for its players, it was business as usual for the people making it.
We thought of it exactly the same as we thought of every other game we ever touched at DMA Design. It wasn't singled out as special in any way, shape, or form. So it was just a case of starting from first principles. What is the game? What's the player going to be doing? What's the experience that we're trying to create? What's fun about it? And then how do we enhance that with audio? Because that's the bit that I always think matters is, as a video game developer, I think sometimes people forget that we tend to think of ourselves as technicians or engineers, but in actual fact, we're entertainers. First and foremost, that's what a video game developer is. You're an entertainer. It's showbiz, right? It's just a very peculiar version of showbiz. So regardless of what role you perform within a video games company, it's not your job to, if you're a programmer, you can't just program. If you're an artist, you can't just do art. It's your job to use your skill in the service of entertaining players. Yeah, that was always the approach I took when we were creating audio for any video game. It's a case of the aim here is to create entertainment. That means drama, spectacle, making something feel bigger than it is, illusion, sleight of hand, all these things to create entertainment, right? And then audio was the thing that we were going to use to do that. And we did that on every project. I did it on Unity Racers, I did it on Kid Kirby, even though nobody will ever know, and I did it on GTA as well. So that process just involved going in, speaking to the team, and absorbing their vision for it. Because if you look back at that original design document for GTA, the mention for audio is something like there will be 1 megabyte of RAM available for sound. That's the audio design. So that's what I got given, and then it was a case of, well, my job is to take it from there to whatever turns up in the game and try and make that entertaining. So, like, it changed a lot along the way, because we certainly didn't start out with the idea of radio stations and all that in it. That came in as we developed it, which was part of the great process of working at DMA Design, was things evolved. And that's messy, and it causes all sorts of problems, and it does tend to cause games to go on longer than they should and run over schedule and so on. But that's also how great ideas happen. They don't turn up neatly on time schedules, and that's just not how creativity works, unfortunately. So we started that game with a fairly constrained view of how it was going to work, in that it wasn't going to be CD based when I started on it. There was going to be a floppy disk version of it. There was no way that we were going to be using CD audio. It was going to have to be MIDI based. We were going to be doing a PC version, so that meant doing some kind of ad-lib kind of chiptune thing. And I wasn't looking forward to that, I'll be honest with you. One of my best days at work ever was when Dave Jones turned up and said that they were cancelling the floppy version and it was going to be a CD release only. And I think the N64 version vanished as well. And I was like, okay. So that's suddenly, from an audio perspective, the lowest common denominator, which you always have to essentially support, vanished and jumped a whole order of magnitude, right? So instead of dealing with ad-lib sound chips, you were going to be dealing with a CD. And that was great, because suddenly DMA Design had a problem, which was they had a game that looked 2D, even though it had that pseudo top-down 3D thing that when you saw it moving actually looked pretty good, but when you saw it in a screenshot it looked pretty naff. So they had this game that looked like a 2D game on a CD, and no matter how high res you made those textures and maps and whatever, it was never going to come anywhere close to filling that CD. Back then, like, when people paid for a CD game, they expected it to use that technology because CD was cutting edge.
It's dustproof, scratch-proof, digitally recorded, read by a laser, and it's called the compact disc.
So we needed a story that made use of it, and we didn't have one. So I just put my hand up and said, I think I know how we could make use of that CD. So that was my suggestion, was let's give it a CD soundtrack, which wasn't revolutionary at that point. There were lots of other games that were already doing it. Wipeout had come out, or was coming out, was in development, and we were reading all these stories about what Tim Wright had been doing with all these club bands and stuff. It was really cool, and we were incredibly jealous. So it's like, well, we want a piece of that action, you know? Why can't we get all our favourite bands in some of our games? And so that's where that started, was let's do a CD soundtrack. But of course, DMA Design didn't have the profile of a company like Sony, who were able to just phone up their record label and get bands to sign up for their games. We didn't have that kind of clout, because even though we'd done Lemmings, it had been a few years and we were just this quirky little game studio in Dundee.
Now, that point about Sony is interesting because Colin's right. DMA was a smaller studio, but the game was published by BMG Interactive, a new interactive wing of the global record publisher. Now, you'd think that would give them the music industry connections they were looking for, but as it turns out, not so much.
Well, that was the weird thing, right? So there just didn't seem to be that crossover between BMG, and there wasn't that kind of thinking. The crossover between BMG Music and BMG Interactive didn't seem to be there. Nobody seemed to make the connection, and certainly anybody that I ever spoke to about could we have some bands to put in this game, you know, nobody was particularly forthcoming on that. So it became quite quickly obvious that we were going to have to make some music. So that was when I put together the idea of, well, let's put together a studio that we can actually do this stuff in-house. And then Craig Connor, who had been working on the game since the inception, essentially, he joined that team at the same time as one day the whole team just turned up, all new starts, and they all sat at their desks, and Craig was on that team. I was speaking to him about it previously, and he was saying it was just random. He didn't come in to work on that game. He just came in and sat at that desk. If he'd sat at another desk, history would have gone in a completely different way. You know? It's funny how it goes sometimes. Anyway, so I'd given Craig the task of writing kind of 10 or 20 little sketches of music, just tasters of what kind of music could we use in this game. Because the premise at that point was still to use a single type of music across the game, because nobody put in different types of music in games at that point. That would have been crazy. And so he sat down and he wrote all these different types of music, some dance, techno, pop, funky stuff, and all different kinds of things. And I just went to review them at his desk one day, and he was playing them, and they were all great. They were all great pieces of music. And I remember thinking, oh, it's a shame we're going to lose, that we're not going to be able to use all these. And he's like, yeah, but, you know, that's just the way you work back then. And without thinking about it, I just said to him, what would be really cool is like if we could get some kind of radio stations in the game where you could play all these different types of music so that you could have all this. And I wasn't thinking about it at all. It was something, it was an offhand comment, and I would have forgotten all about it except for Craig's face when I said it. I saw Craig's face and his eyes lit up, you know, and that kind of, that would be brilliant. And I remember looking at him and thinking, it just paused me long enough to think, actually, that might work.
More music than you can possibly imagine. Much more music.
Funk FM.
So that was the spark. Like I say, we didn't have the idea when we started the project. It cropped up as we went. And then was the practical problem of, okay, if nobody's going to license us music and we need to do a CD soundtrack, then how the hell do we do this? And that was where it's a case of, right, we're going to need a recording studio, and we're going to need we're going to need people to record music in all these different genres. And we knew right from the start it wasn't going to be any good to do it just to have music. It was going to have to sound good enough that people could believe these were songs that were on the radio and they just hadn't heard them. That was going to be hard. And we had no idea when we started whether or not we could do it. I guess we were young enough and naive enough to just assume we could, which probably helped. But we certainly didn't have any evidence that we could do it, that's for sure. Essentially what it came down to was we went through a culling process, because the first thing we did was sat down and think, okay, if we're going to do this, what genres could we have? And, we just went wild, and we had everything in there from jazz fusion to opera to techno, and just like go crazy. And then we went through the practical stage, which was, okay, which of these genres do we think that we could do a reasonable pastiche of just with the people we have in this room and deliver in time for the game to go out on schedule? So that was when we culled it. And it's like, well, I can play guitar, so I can handle any of the genres that need guitar. So rock and funk, I'll take those. Craig was big into his club music at that time, so and he had a really cool analog synth that none of the rest of us had. So it's like, right, you do that stuff, and the hip hop stuff as well. It's like, yep, he'll take care of that. And then Grant Middleton, he was big into his kind of electronic ambient and Berlin School EM. So it's like, okay, all that stuff you deal, and then the bits that crossed over in the middle, we kind of just picked out, like country and western, for example. I guess, well, I play guitar, I'll do it. So if we got stuck, then we would make inquiries. So the hip hop stuff, for example, we knew we needed somebody who could carry off the vocal, and we knew that nobody that was in the audio department at DMA was going to be able to do it. And we just got really lucky in that one of the guys who was working at DMA Design got in touch with me. So just literally in the office one day said, I've got a mate that I know who's studying at Dundee College just now, and he's doing this hip hop stuff. He's really good. You should check him out. It was just this kid at, I think it was Dundee College he was at. I think he might even been studying chemistry. He was playing hip hop in his spare time around Dundee, just in clubs and pubs. And like I say, one of the guys at DMA had heard it and recommended him. And then a lot of it was done through Rainbow Music, which is our music shop in Dundee that we bought a lot of equipment from, obviously, for the audio department. Anytime we were stuck, we'd just go and say, do you guys, because everybody went through there. It was a bit of it was a social network of its day, right? Anybody who was in town and had any musical inclination would end up there at some point, so they knew everybody. So when I was doing the country track, for example, back to your point about, like, do you just go and get somebody who can play country and western? The instruments I knew that I needed that I couldn't play was I needed somebody who could play pedal steel guitar, and I had no idea who that was going to be. So I went and asked at Rainbow, and the guys were like, well, Chris, the guy that Chris Mara, who was working in the shop at the time, he plays pedal steel. So yeah, he's like, oh yeah, totally. I'm like, great. Says, can we organise a session? So he's like, yeah, no problem. Do you want me to bring a banjo? I'm like, yeah, if you can. He says, I can play mouth organ as well. Do you want me to bring it? I was like, bring it on, bring it on. So we just got lucky. We got incredibly lucky with people. And what I think it proved to me was there was no shortage of talent in and around Dundee. It was the platform for that talent that was missing. It was the opportunity to show it off. Certainly at that time, maybe a bit different now with YouTube and whatever else. There's a lot more opportunities for people to show what they can do. But back then, if you had somebody who was an amazing rapper in Dundee, good luck.
Uptown, downtown, speeding all around. The naked 27 got the power and it's bound to move any mother that gets in my way. Just another power machine on the freeway. Riding with me, there's my MC homeboy. Knowing the rules ain't part of his program. Finding the right way around this.
So yeah, that was how it all came together. And anytime we needed somebody that we didn't have, we'd just get in touch with somebody, or like, do you know anybody? And it was just a friend of a friend that brought it all together. Keith McIntosh at Rainbow Music was the main man at that point, and certainly Chris Mara's still around. He still plays in lots of pub bands and wedding bands and things around Dundee. He's an amazing player. The best, actually, one story, I don't think I've ever told this story before, but it still amazes me, was he brought his mouth organ to play that. There's a mouth organ part on the country track. He brought his mouth organ to play it, but he brought it in the wrong key. So mouth organs are in a particular key, and if the song's in a different key, it doesn't work. So we actually had that. I remember having to feed his microphone, the mouth organ microphone, through a pitch shifter in real time and back into his headphones so that he could hear it in the right key. Now, when I think about that, like nowadays, that's nothing. You can do that no problem. But that was 1995, 96 that we did that. And when I think about it now, it didn't seem at all special at the time. But yeah, that was really unusual. So yeah, we had to real-time pitch shift his wrong key mouth organ in order to get that mouth organ part. So the mouth organ you hear on that track was playing in the wrong key, and the version you hear is the digitally pitch shifted version.
Well, my granddaddy jumped up from his table, finished his jug, and he got up to that mine just as lickety-darn split as he could. Stopped off to fetch a shovel, feed the dogs, brush his teeth, clean the john, and give his horse one final rub down. 'Cause a cowboy's life ain't easy.
I remember having to like strap the cans on really tight so that so you couldn't hear the natural pitch. But all credit to him, he made it work. That's the kind of player Chris was.
'Cause she never once forgave him, even underneath the cave-in, but he knew she would forgive him in that gold mine in the sky.
Oh yeah, going all the way back there. That was the ballad of Chaplips Calhoun by the late...
All right, so far we've been focusing a lot on the music, which of course, as you've heard, is fantastic. But as development went on, the plan was for GTA to feel like a real city. And real cities aren't just music. They're the sounds of pedestrians and cars and people shouting for some reason, and that stuff can take a long time. Luckily for Colin and his team, and maybe less so for their publisher, the game kept getting delayed.
One of the great things about working on GTA was that it ran over a lot. So that's a bit of a pun, I guess. No, it went on way longer than it was meant to. So it was meant to be finished in 1996. I think we eventually just managed to scrape it in 1997. So there was a lot of time to figure out little details and bits and pieces that we would never have had time to do if we hadn't had the opportunity to play it. Because that's what it really comes down to. Like, when you're doing audio for games, I always think that one of the most important things you can do as an audio designer in a video game is play the damn game. So if you don't have a version of the game that's playable until very late in the day, then it's incredibly hard because you don't have much time between getting a playable version and having to get the game finished. So you just have to put in, like, that'll do, get it out the door. But GTA was different because it did run on way longer than it was meant to. Even though it wasn't stable, it was a very buggy, very unstable mess for a large part of its development cycle. You could play it long enough to get a feel for, like, oh, right, so there's going to be... You can see these little pedestrians crossing the street, and when you've got a team of audio-obsessed people working on your game, then it's just natural. Again, going back to that point I was making about it's our job to use audio to create the best entertainment we can. It's then a case of, right, what can we do when that pedestrian's crossing the road in order to make it fun, make it funnier than it is? And so giving them life, giving them comments, things that they say.
Hey, screw you, asshole!
Again, these things evolved. We'd never have predicted it. Same with the police radio and things. The text was going to come up to say where the crime was being committed, and what's the best way of representing that through audio? So we created that concatenated. There's a 1014 in Northwest Hack and Slash.
1014 in Northwest Hack and Slash.
Which again, I'm sure lots of people have done it, but it didn't really matter back then because you didn't know anybody else had done it because you couldn't find out things without an internet.
Speaking of the police radio, there's something that's been bothering Danny for a long time, and finally, he got to ask the person responsible.
One question about the cops and that, because it's just like struck a chord in my head, and I'm trying to remember. This is why my job is the best, because there are things that have bothered me forever that I didn't get to talk to the actual person who did it. So there's an audio sample of a female dispatch officer, and the one thing I'm forgetting is if this is in 1 or 3. I can't remember if this is in GTA 1 or 3, but it's used in fucking every TV show. This
oh right,
She's
Yeah,
like
I know what you mean.
5 George K or something. I forget what she says. Something.
Yeah, I know it.
5 George K.
5 George K. 496 Broadway between Broome and Spring.
For like 30 years or whatever it is, 20 years, I've heard it everywhere. Did you get this from like a, was that in one? And did you get this from like a audio
Yeah,
library or
it's
something?
in one. So it's not actually in the. It's not a sample that's used in memory. It's not a sound effect that plays. It's the police radio channel. So if you get into a cop car, then 'cause it didn't seem at all realistic that you would have cops listening to funk or hip hop at that time. Maybe now, I don't know. So we just put in this dispatch officer reading out stuff, and it's literally just a sample from a sample library. And I think it's, if memory serves, it's a sample library called Sound Ideas, and it might be the 6000 series. That's my memory of it. But yeah, I've heard it everywhere as well. It turns up literally everywhere. It's
Everywhere.
like that Wilhelm scream. You just hear it everywhere.
Totally. It is the Wilhelm screen of like cop procedurals.
Definitely, yeah. So guilty as charged, officer.
That's amazing. Fucking hell. I love my job.
Okay, so when the game shipped in 1997, DMA Design still wasn't sure what the reception would be like. The first GTA was largely a new idea, and it was hard to know if people were going to enjoy it. By the next year, though, shipments of the game on PC and PlayStation 1 topped 1 million units. It was a bestseller in the UK, and while reviews were somewhat middling, the general reception was that the music and the sound effects were the stars of the show.
Yeah, that was the reception to it. Felt like vindication. It felt like we had really done what we set out to achieve. Because remembering when we started, we didn't know if we could even do it, and we set the bar really high as well. We knew it wasn't going to work. We knew we weren't going to have delivered what we needed to deliver unless we had journalists not sure whether these were real bands or not, and also players as well. I remember having a conversation with Raymond Usher where we were talking about how we would know if the audio was as good as we'd wanted it to be, and we came up with this story that was, if we hear that people are stopping the cars to listen to particular tracks, then we've probably done a good job. And I think within about the first week, there was a review came out where one of the journalists said, I even parked the car at the side of the road and just listened to this track because I didn't want it to end. And we're like, yes, nailed it. So that was certainly a huge relief, was when that came out, and it got such a positive reception. Because the game itself was a bit patchy. It took a lot of flack. So you'd often read reviews that were like, yeah, the game's okay, but the soundtrack's amazing. So that was incredibly rewarding. Because remembering back then as well, audio in video games nowadays is held in high regard as something truly worthwhile, as an art form and whatever else. Back then, we couldn't get musicians to believe it was music. Like literally, you'd speak to other musicians and they'd say, "What are you doing?" Like, "Oh, I'm a musician." And they'd say, "What kind of stuff do you do?" "Oh, video game music." And they were just like, "I thought you said you were a musician." It's like, "Yeah, I am." It's like, no, that's not music. That's not music. So you forget again just how much culturally has changed in the interim. So the one phrase that always used to really bug me was when you got a review for a game. So Uniracers would be a great example, where it would say, "Oh, music's fantastic, for game music." And it was always that, "Oh, for game music." That was the bane of my life, that phrase. But GTA changed that. Suddenly nobody was talking about for game music. It was just music. And it's like, yes, that's when we knew we'd done something special. We'd crossed an important barrier that we'd never felt we'd crossed before.
With the first Grand Theft Auto being a financial success that was received well enough, it was time to get started on the next one. And like any good sequel, the focus was on taking what people liked and making it bigger and better. Fortunately, what people liked was what Colin wanted to do more of.
Well, GTA 2 felt like an opportunity to fix or address, or in other words, change the bits that we either didn't like or didn't have time to do or hadn't thought about. But there was very little of it, as I recall, that we hadn't thought about it. The brainstorming all happened on GTA. Once that, hey, we could put radio stations in the game happened, the rest of it just poured out. It's something that I think you find occasionally in creative industries when you come across an idea that's the right idea at the right time. You know it's the right idea at the right time because you cannot stop riffing on it. It just, ideas lead to ideas, and before you know it, you've got this flood of more things than you can possibly do. So it's almost like a key. It just unlocks a door and ideas flood out. So we had no shortage of ideas from GTA 1. Because there's a lot of things that I was talking to somebody else who were saying, GTA 3 introduced talk radio. It's like, yeah, it did. But the idea for that was like way back. That was one of the ones that we did right at the start of GTA 1, was this idea of having talk shows and DJs and things like that. But it was just too hard to execute at that point for all sorts of reasons. We hardly did any of the DJ stuff or any of the adverts because it was hard enough just doing the music. That was a major hill climb. But then by the time we'd done that and proven it for GTA 1, it was, right, let's go back and see what we can put into GTA 2 that we didn't have time. So the big ones was we want radio DJs. We want personalities on these stations who are presenting this music, living in the world. Again, it's all part of the entertainment value. It was about pretending that this was a real place, a real city with real people in it, so that when you were looking at these tiny top-down characters that were wandering around, we couldn't render them in glorious visual detail, but you could hear them talking. They were saying things. They were phoning into radio stations and things like that. So that, as a player, that just kind of bleeds through into everything, and you start to see the game differently because of how it sounds.
This KGBH radio, this no-nonsense radio station. If you get pissed off, you don't like station, you just change it. Don't listen, okay? If you don't want to listen, don't listen. This ridiculous. I don't have to listen to you don't listen to me. Just turn it off. But KGBH plays the best black...
So that was the priority for GTA 2, and we knew we could do the music. There's just going to need to be an awful lot more of it. But that was fine, because now that people knew it worked, it was easier to get budget to allocate more people to come in and do music. So that was the main ones, was the get the DJs, DJ personalities, and then adverts. We wanted the irreverent adverts in as part of it as well. Again, we didn't do it in GTA 1, partly because we didn't have time, but partly because none of us had heard American radio. That was the other thing. Again, you can hear American radio no problem these days, but back then, if you wanted to hear American radio, we had to get guys who were coming over from BMG to bring tapes, like cassettes, so that we could hear what American radio sounded like. And so that was the main focus for GTA 2. We tried a few other things, like we tried putting ranges on the station so that you could triangulate where a station was, because the idea was that we're going to place these physically in the map, and you could go and visit the radio stations, bomb them to take them out, and that would switch that radio station off, right? So you essentially had a switch off the music button, but it was naturalized into the game rather than having some menu thing where you just switch the music off. So that was the kind of thinking that we were doing. But it came together. It wasn't easy, but it was definitely a sequel in that it felt like the same thing again, but different. Michael Keeler, who came in to do, I think he was doing writing on the project, but we managed to second him to the audio department for a period of time to get him to do all the scripts for the DJs and, to create the personalities and then to come up with ideas for these products and then to script out adverts that we could actually act. And he did an amazing job. He did an absolutely amazing job, because when you listen to GTA today, the DNA of what you're listening to is right there in GTA 2 when you listen to adverts for Zoom Zoom.
Get up, lazy. It's time for work.
What?
You heard me. Up, up, up.
I'm tired.
You need Zoom Zoom, the legal wake-up that lasts all day.
Whoa! Zoom Zoom, the recently legalized pre-breakfast nasal wake-up call, developed exclusively by...
There were so many great adverts that he did. But he handled the writing. He would just bring ideas. We'd go through them, like that one, don't like that one, knock them about a bit, and then he'd go back and flesh them out. And then he handled the direction for the recording as well, because that's so important. It's one thing to write a script, but to actually get an actor to deliver it and in a way that can then be brought back and edited into a believable shape to use in a fictitious world it's a hell of a task. And him and Craig Connor did that between them, and did an amazing job of it. But the main challenges with GTA 2 was scheduling it and all the boring operational production stuff. Creatively, it was nowhere near as satisfying to do as GTA 1 had been, because we were literally it felt like just filling in the bits that we hadn't had time to do, rather than having those amazing exploration into new ideas. We didn't really have that in GTA, partly because of time, but partly just because the exploration part had been done on GTA 1, and now it was the execution part, which is nowhere near as fun. I'm really proud of that game. Not just the audio, like what the design team and everything pulled together, and also the art team as well, how they managed to lift that whole thing. It was a worthy successor to GTA 1, I always thought.
All right, that was Mr. Colin Anderson, one of several Scottish accents you will be listening to in our DMA design documentary. Yeah, how was the accent, Jesse? Was it was rough or?
It wasn't that bad. I think you're overstating how hard it is to understand, but maybe I'm just used to accents from that area. A lot of BBC shows.
Right, yeah. Some of them are, I feel like Colin, he also had a clean recording because he's the audio guy, right?
Yeah, so thank you, by the way, if he hears this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, guy. He recorded on a separate little thing. Mike Daly's a little bit more sort of rough and ready Highland accent.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, don't worry, we'll have captions, and all these. There's a lot of Celtic accents between me and the various interviewees. But it's a meaty doc. It should be like 50 minutes to maybe an hour actually at this stage, but packed full of interesting anecdotes. Jesse, did you have any thoughts coming out of that? Like, what's the type of stuff that you think sort of stands out from that conversation, or what elements were you most interested in as somebody who, again, hadn't really experienced these games in the moments that they were so impactful, but as, at least you seem to see the historical sort of relevance of them given where we are now with that series.
Yeah, I think it was interesting, the bit where he's talking about the radio being something that they wanted to do more of in the first two games, because they wanted to have more of that talk radio aspect. They wanted to have those advertisements. They wanted to have people calling in, but they couldn't do it from a technical perspective, which I think speaks to how early those games are in the series, but also how early they were for that idea, that implementation of games like that. Because there were games that were kind of open in that time, like in the mid to late 90s, but there weren't games like Grand Theft Auto that were about, playing in a city and having that exact tone and playing radios. That wasn't a thing that games were doing, right?
Yeah, I mean that's the crux of it, kind of is the technical implementation that happened kind of as almost by accident, just by virtue of the fact that like the CD was there to be used and they weren't using it.
Exactly. It was interesting too, hearing how like they had to figure things out as they went along. Like there's so many parts of it where they're like, yeah, we'll do it this way. And then there's that light bulb moment. Like the fact that coming up with the radio, like actually doing it that way was something that they just kind of offhanded said, like that Colin just said to somebody as a joke and just came and went. And then they were like, well, actually, and now that's been a foundation for this series for decades. Like it's something that I think about when I think about Grand Theft Auto is the music, not just the licensed tracks, but also the sounds that play on the menu screen and stuff, and how important that is to that franchise. And the fact that such a core thing was just an offhand comment that somebody made in a conversation with somebody that they worked with, that is insane to me, but is also, I think, something that's so common in any creative field, especially in the games industry.
Well, it isn't so much now, perhaps, or maybe it is in like a micro level. But yeah, I think what's interesting, and we definitely dive into this in the doc, is the idea that back then people didn't know what games were yet.
Yeah.
And especially during that transition between 2D and 3D, games before this era were sort of, they had one thing they were doing interesting, usually. That was enough. Like, you can make a different shmup and just have it have a weird weapon, and that was enough to be interesting. And when you look at the like menagerie of games that DMA were working on at that time, it was a lot of really weird games. Like Tank Tix is a game where you're like a pteranodon building tanks with a, you know, with a top, a middle, and a bottom, and then it's kind of a real-time strategy game. And then Space Station Silicon Valley is a game where you're sort of, I don't know, jumping into robotic animals to complete levels. Like, they're just like there was no rhyme or reason. We didn't have established genres. We didn't have a lot of established control schemes.
Right.
So everything was kind of up for grabs. And then kind of what we're looking at now when we see these things that persisted is the ideas that did work. And we don't see the ones that didn't because they stopped. Somewhere along the line, we lost those. For GTA, at least, the radio stations was one that, you know, and outside of the radio stations, just the contemporary pop culture. Like, that's the way they sell the world to you. Even in GTA 3, when you get into those, you know, cars at the start, they're playing certain radio stations. Like, the first thing that happens in GTA 3 when you get in the car on the bridge is that there's a news report about what just happened.
Yeah,
about the breakout.
exactly.
Like, it's such a core part of it.
I love those moments.
I think we got some tweets as well. We put the word out a little bit late about this podcast.
We
got
did,
some
yeah.
tweets. What we got there, Jesse?
Well, we've got some really great questions here. One from Paranoid Q on Twitter asks, I played GTA 2 a fuck ton back in the day and was blown away when I found out there was more than one city. I guess my question is, how big or small were these games back in the day? Why didn't other developers try to run with these ideas? Because as a kid, GTA 2 was magic.
That's funny. So obviously they didn't play GTA 1 because, and also like GTA 2, I think it was only one city, but it was like 3 different parts of it or something. Because it's called like, what was it called? It was called like Nowhere USA or every town USA or something. It was kind of like a mega city because that whole game was like supposed to be 5 minutes into the future was the concept they'd been given. But yeah, I wonder this. We covered a bit where especially the PlayStation version of GTA 2 didn't have San Andreas in it for a long time. We found out because they weren't sure it was going to fit on the disc. Actually, wait, I forget which one comes third. Maybe it was Vice City that was. I forget which order they go in, but the third one didn't make it. But then eventually did. They got it on there. I wonder. I think it just comes from the like levels. Like back then, games had levels. So even if your level is big, you need a new level when you complete the level, right? So here's another level. But yeah, it's crazy how they each had their own like graphic style and everything. Like we show off a bunch of tile sets in the dock of like, here are all the cars they use in San Andreas and in Vice City and in Liberty City, because this one needs to look like this city and this one needs to look like this one, and like none of them had been to America. Like that's one of my favorite lines from Colin is when he talks about how they used to get radio recordings sent over from BMG US because they'd never heard American radio. Like
that's so funny because now American everything is everywhere. So it's so funny that just 20 years ago or 25 years ago you couldn't hear that everywhere. What a time to be alive. That sounds pretty nice.
Yeah, exactly. There was no way of like. I remember we were talking to them a bit about like especially because I'm from a small city in a Celtic country, right? And Dundee is kind of like similar. It's the 4th biggest town in Scotland. I'm from the 4th biggest town in Ireland. And yeah, like my connection to the world of video games was the magazine that turned up every month in my local bookshop. Like that was the PC Gamer was how I knew what the fuck was going on in video games back then. And if it turned up late, I didn't hear about it. And then you hear about everything in one magazine. You're just like flying through like, what was I want Half-Life. Is it been out for a couple of weeks? How good is it? The review's finally out. It's a different time.
All right, we got another question from Alan on Twitter. I remember that if you put your GTA 1 disc into a CD player, you could play the music from the game, but it had like 99 tracks. I know this was common, but I felt like a 12-year-old hacker when I discovered it. Yeah, I remember that happening with some of the older games on PC. That was like a super common thing, well, not super common, but fairly common thing because they were audio CDs, right?
Yeah, so that's like Colin gets into it in the doc where the whole CD audio thing. They it was a much better quality than you would have been used to, especially a generation behind. CDs were able to hold a large amount of data, but even then, you end up, especially audio files, you end up compressing that stuff down pretty significantly. Whereas the music, they could just roll off it. So yeah, like Wipeout 2047 was another great example of this. There was loads of PlayStation games, even those black CDs were able to be put in a CD player and have the music play on them if they use the CD audio. So yeah, it was just like a lot of people figuring out like how to, like, I wouldn't be surprised if you did it. You don't need to do it these days anymore, but like also these days we don't run games off discs anymore. You know what I mean?
That's true. Yeah.
The discs are just there to like install 10% of the game.
Just a code.
It downloads the rest. Yeah. Exactly.
It is funny too, because this is like, it's a cool aspect of it. Like, it's cool if you really like the music that you can take the CD and put it in a CD player.
Yeah.
But the fact that 12-year-olds did it makes me think that they were like, duh, what happens if I put my disc in here? Like,
totally.
Just like a stupid move.
Well, yeah, you probably didn't, or maybe like somebody said it.
Yeah.
I wonder, like, if I could go back, I wonder how many CDs I put in a CD player that like didn't work, just to see.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You could also kind of see it if you looked at a CD. If you look at the bottom of a CD and like shine the light, you can kind of see if it's got music on it. Like you can see the amount of data. At least back then, I remember. I think it was harder on the PlayStation ones because they were like so deep black and you couldn't really get the look at them. But you could kind of see if there was data on there. And I always remember. This might be totally made up in my brain now, but like I always remember the music looked different. Like you could see the line of where the track would start, almost like a record. You could you could tell if there was music on it or something. God, it was so strange. This reminds me of like one of the craziest stories we ever heard, which was, like old Commodore 64 games. They were on tapes, and there was a lot of this era were on tapes, and you would record the games on tape decks from one to another. You would record one tape deck onto another one, and almost like a modem, it would build the game based off the noise that was on the tape. And we did a documentary on CD Projekt, and they talked about how during the height of communism and nobody having any like copyright law,
right,
people would just broadcast games over the radio, and they would sit at home and record them.
And you would record the tape, and that's how you would get the game.
Yeah, they'd say like,
what?
Okay, we're recording in like 3, 2, 1, and you'd hit the button, and they'd play like white noise over the radio
but
station.
It turns out it was secretly a video game. That's the most cyberpunk thing,
isn't it?
That's amazing.
It's like the craziest story I think we've ever come across, and it just like, what a time to be alive, all this weird nonsense.
Yeah, back in the good old days of technology when it wasn't, your discs are codes and that's it. Your physical hardware doesn't matter.
So the interviews that we got, all that sort of stuff, it's a lot, and the doc sort of covers a lot.
Right.
And this music part is only sadly one sort of chapter of a chapter in a really big story. So I'm excited to get it out there. I think people some people were kind of saying like, oh, the DMA story has been told a bunch of times, there's already a lot of information about this. We did manage to get a bunch of extra information from the Video Game History Foundation, a bunch of extra assets. I think the interviews and the angle we go for is different. It sort of talks a lot about Scotland in the 90s, about the history of Dundee, about the history of these like post-industrial towns and the way they try and adapt and evolve in the 20th century, and how like sort of Dundee did and my hometown didn't is kind of like one of the subtexts that I'm sort of like pulling from, and what was it about Dundee that sort of that was different, like why it became this sort of like tech creative journalism hub in Scotland that like even in the years since DMA left has gone on. It's one of the biggest game dev hubs in the UK. It has like multiple colleges that have really good game dev courses, and a bunch of studios there now, and Real Time Worlds, of course, with all the Crackdown stuff was happening around before. So there's a lot. It's like a big project. So it was cool at least to snip this little part out and have a chinwag about it.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun to work on for sure.
Yeah, thanks so much for doing it, man. It was a lot of work. There's a lot of audio and music and shenanigans.
But that's what I love. I love putting that stuff in there, adding the diegetic sound and the music and everything. And like I've been saying, this is such a fantastic sound, even though some of the stuff is a little insensitive. It's still like just great music. It's very nostalgic for a lot of people. And even for people like me who grew up playing the later games, it's still very cool to hear about what it was like when it started and how much of that came through.
Yeah, it's wild that like a game. I posted, what was it, the tweet like an hour ago, asking for questions, and I just
with
used
the picture
screenshot.
yeah,
and like people were like, "Oh, this is just like the most nostalgic picture ever." And you can say that about those games, but you can also say that about the music in these games, and that's really saying something else. That like years later, people remember lyrics or remember tunes. Or was it Gary Whitta said to me earlier on Twitter that he still plays head radio sometimes today, just to listen to it. So yeah, really lasted the test of time. These weird little games, and obviously spawned the biggest franchise in our industry.
Exactly, for better or for worse.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for better. I love those games.
Oh,
I don't know.
Okay.
You don't like those games?
Oh, no, I love those games. I'm just talking about the development side.
I mean, yeah, see, that's the other thing is that, like, I would love to actually get into Rock. There are, like, the three I've always wanted, Bethesda, Valve, and Rockstar, the three that I would love to talk about, because as much as, like Rockstar is not the only place in the world where crunch happens.
Of course.
Also, the type of crunch that happens there, I don't know about it. And also... And this is my biggest problem with the way in which we sort of talk about Rockstar in the media, because it is basically such an easy click. Like, it's one of those stories, and I've been part of a newsroom and a games website. Like, if you write about Rockstar, people click on it.
Right.
So it behooves you to write about it when anything happens, and it's usually something bad. And as much as that is like part of the conversation, I hate that the only thing that we ever talk about when it comes to Rockstar is the Housers and now crunch, because it's a studio of like thousands of people who are clearly some of the best people at what they do in the world.
Right, definitely.
And when we reduce them to like,
you got crunched, and that's kind of it. Yeah.
Yeah, like a horde of people who are just at the beckoning call of these, execs. Like, that's not what the reality is. Like, I don't know what the reality is, but it's not that. So I'd love to, it's one of the things that I'm like, it's like the long pitch to like eventually try, and I'd love to get in there and talk to those folks. They are easily one of the least open studios to dev interviews in particular. Outside of a couple of GDC talks, you don't generally get that much information about process there.
Right.
But like, they're the best in the biz. So
yeah, it'd be great to hear more from them for sure.
Yeah. What a shame. So
yeah,
maybe one of these days we'll get it. We'll see. But yeah, I've heard it from all sides. I've heard how tough it is on the QA side there, that they really run people through the ringer. But I also know people who've been there for 15 years and clearly like it, and people who have gone up through the ranks there in the past 10 years. And I wish we could just get people on the records to talk about some of the fucking stuff they do there, because they're wizards.
And one day, fingers crossed.
Yeah. Fingers crossed, one of these days. In terms of docs that are coming, like I said, DMA is coming soon. We will have it up on the 20th of the month. The Forgotten City is in early access already right now, so if you're an early access patron, you can go watch that right now. Thank you to Jake for putting that together. It's super good, 35 minutes long, all about the Forgotten City. Crazy story of development. One guy who made a game who had to quit his job, his high-paying, high-profile job, to make this game and either land himself in a life's worth of death with no career or pull it off. And spoilers, that game is pretty good. We also have a bunch of Patreon content going up this month as we load up for 2022. And we will have our Game of the Year podcast next week. So I'm excited to talk to you and Frank and Jeremy all about our games of the year. And we'll be putting up a post on Patreon for people to send in theirs. And of course, podcast at noclip.video if you have any thoughts or games that you want us to talk about. If you'd like to support the podcast, fund our docs, get access to all the bonus episodes and the official Discord, you can do so at patreon.com/noclip. I am at Daniel Dwyer. He is at
Garasha. That's Guara, S like Sam, CIA on Twitter.
Thank you, sir. At Noclip Video, we are. Watch the docs over on youtube.com/Noclip Video. Listen to your podcast anywhere you want, or youtube.com/Noclip Podcast. And drop that review if you can do so. I think Halo's out in 22 minutes.
It is.
What are you doing today?
No, I got to go. Let's end this now. I got to get it started, all right? I got to get the preload going.
Yeah, they wouldn't let us. I don't think there was like a pre-download available, was there? It was like
no, there was. No, they had a preload up for the campaign. No, there was.
Oh, they did.
Yeah.
Damn, I've been trying to see it. Okay, I need to go figure that out because now I need to download it in 22 minutes.
Yeah.
So we can go finish the fight again for the 7th time. Always finish the fight.
When is this fight gonna be over?
I know, right? When is the Halo gonna be okay?
Yeah, come on.
Poor Halo. Beyonce even wrote a song about it. What a shame. Poor thing. Jesse, thanks so much, dude.
You're welcome.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Halo.
Woo.